So today on Out of Order Garage, Saturn Vue, 360 some odd thousand miles, is due for another timing belt replacement. This one has the Honda 3.5 V6 double overhead cam. It's recommended to change the belt every 100,000 miles. So let's get after it. So one of the first things to do is to jack it up, put it on jack stands, and take the right front wheel off so we can get access to the front of the motor. The front of the motor faces towards us on this passenger side here because it's Crossway's powertrain. So after you take the wheel off, you have to take this plastic splash shield off. It's held on with these little push pins. You can prime it apart with a screwdriver, but this little tool here, just grab the tip of it, pull it apart, and it pulls the fastener apart. And it's just have to tap them back in with a hammer when you're all done. So the balancer bolt is on so tight, you need this high mass socket. Notice how thick it is? Gives it the mass that's needed to get that balancer bolt off. Next we'll take off the air intake. Got hose clamp, 10mm bolt. This clips, the air filter comes out. There's a couple 10mm bolts that hold all this in. Pretty easy. Before anything, take your 8mm, disconnect your battery. Very important. Taking the computer out just to make it easier to get to these, because that's where the timing belt is, behind all this plastic covering. You have to take this motor mount out. Those are 15mm, and there's two, you can see it around there. I probably can't. Anyway, two 15s, two 18s. Serpentine belt is already off in this shot, but if you take a 14mm wrench, hopefully a long one, and push towards the back of the car, that idler pulley will release tension on the belt. On this car, all the belt does is go from the balancer to the AC compressor to the alternator to the idler, and that's it. No power steering pump on this car. It's electric power steering. If you have a Honda with a similar motor, they said there'll be a power steering pump somewhere over here you have to take loose. Now we just have to take off all the 10mm bolts that hold these dust shields over this timing belt, as well as take this bolt off, which holds this wiring bracket to this piece. This piece will come off of the engine after the plastic pieces are off. Back when there's a little more to look at. Need one of these 10mm timing cover bolts. I lost one last time I did it, and I forgot that it's still missing. The balancer will just pull off by hand. You have to rock it back and forth a bit, but you don't need a puller. It's kind of like a loose press fit. Need both hands to do this. And after the balancer slash pulley is off, just take off the rest of these 10mm bolts for this lower plastic timing cover. The keyway is very important. It was loose and it almost fell out and got lost. And the other thing is this slinger not slinger, it's a, I believe it's a belt guide. That's very important as well. So don't lose those pieces and make sure they go back on the way they came out. Next, take this big aluminum motor mount adapter piece off the block with 3 14mm fasteners. All right, we got everything out of the way. Next step is to set the motor to top dead center, line up the timing marks, and then take off the belt, swap out the water pump, put on the new idler and tensioner pulleys, and put it all back together. So now we have to turn the engine clockwise until the timing marks line up. You see there's a mark on the top of that gear, and then there's a little pointy mark cast into the front of the engine there. Those two have to line up. Then at the top, this mark here has to line up with that mark there. Kind of hard to see it. There we go. That mark there, and then same thing over there. So rotate the engine only clockwise to get the marks lined up. If all these marks don't line up, rotate the engine one full additional revolution. Remember, the crank rotates twice for every 1 revolution of the cams. So if we rotated this engine another full revolution, these cams would be in a different spot. And then if we rotated it another revolution, they'd be back to how you see it now. So with that set like that, we could take the belt off, put the new one on. There's several ways to get the belt off. One of them is to take off this first static idler pulley, pull that off, and then the belt will be pretty loose and we can get it off. Then we'll take off the movable idler tensioner pulley, and we'll take off the water pump after that. You can see that even before the bolt is all the way out, that the belt is loose because the pulley is you can barely see it down there. See how it's flopping on the big, once the big washer gets free of the big hole, it moves over and you can get the belt loose. Pretty neat design, huh? The bolt head here is 14mm. Here's the static idler pulley. We use the shim, which came in the kit. It doesn't call for it on the Saturn Vue. It calls for it in some of the like Acura or the other applications that this motor was used in. But I think it was there last time and I put it back in, and we're going to use it again. So, but we'll use the new shim from the other kit. It doesn't make any difference, it's just a shim, but it doesn't matter which one we use. So it's supposed to prevent some of the timing belt noise in some of these applications. I don't know. So read the directions and make your own decisions. The belt just slips out. The belt doesn't look too bad, but it's got over 100,000 miles on it. They recommend you change it. It's not the rubber that goes bad. There's nylon or fiberglass or some kind of reinforcement inside, and that's what goes bad. Cheap insurance. This is an interference motor. If this belt breaks, valves hit the pistons and motor's pretty much toast. Next step is to get the movable tensioner assembly and pulley off. 14mm as well. There's the tensioner assembly. This sleeve and this bolt need to be reused and put onto the new assembly, which comes in the kit, which we'll look at in a little while. We need to take off the hydraulic tensioner assembly, which held on with two 10mm bolts. We'll get that off. A new one of those comes in the kit as well. And there's the hydraulic tensioner. Look at it. It looks like it was leaking. It's got hydraulic fluid in it. So anyway, just another reason to get the whole kit and change everything. Next, we'll take the water pump off. About half a dozen or so 10mm bolts. We'll get after that. So after taking off 5 bolts, a little bit of prying action. Well, maybe a little bit more prying action. There we go. And the water pump is off. We're going to do a coolant change anyway, and probably a thermostat change too. So it's all good. There you go. One water pump off. And there's the water pump. Pretty simple. All right. We're going to clean up the front of the engine there. Brake cleaner and rinse that off and make sure all that area back there is clean, and we'll get to putting it back together. So this is the kit I'm using for the timing belt, Gates TCKWP329. This is the same one I put in last time. Let's see what's in the kit. Well, got the timing belt and water pump. Hydraulic tensioner, the movable tensioner assembly, the static idler pulley, and the shim that we talked about earlier that goes behind that static pulley if needed, and an instruction book. So let's get after the water pump and everything on. The water pump gasket on this is brilliant design. It's an O-ring, calibrated O-ring that fits in the groove. No sealant necessary. It doesn't call for any. When you tighten it down, this part contacts the engine block and squeezes this O-ring to the perfect compression. There's no over tightening or under tightening. Valve covers are the same way. Pretty neat design. Well, let's get that on. 5 10mm bolts. Cleaned up the mating surfaces to make sure they're perfectly clean, and we'll get the water pump on now. Getting ready to put the tensioner on. I highly recommend using Loctite on the bolts that hold this tensioner on, as well as the bolts that hold these idlers on. Very important step. It even came from the factory like that with Loctite on it. So don't forget that step. Well, the tensioner is on. 10mm deep socket and 1/4 inch ratchet seem to work good for this job. On to the next thing. For the movable idler, got to reuse the bolt, of course, but also this sleeve needs to be reused. So take it out of the old one, put it in the new one. I put a tiny bit of grease in the new one, and we'll clean that up first, but you get the idea. Loctite on the bolt. Let's put it in. Here we put the static idler on. We use Loctite on that bolt as well. And we use that little shim behind there that we talked about earlier. Starting to thread the timing belt through and getting it set. We're going to use this picture here in case we forgot how it went. So we'll set it all up like that. Make sure it's right with the timing marks and everything. And then we'll pull that little pin on the tensioner and tension the belt for good. And then we'll rotate the motor around probably 2 to 4 times to make sure the timing marks are still lined up. Here's the first try at it. I think this is too loose. I think I need to pull this one tooth more around this sprocket here. Looks like I don't have enough to go around there, so keep fiddling with it. So I got the belt on how I think it's right, but I can't get it stretched over this movable idler. So what I'm going to do is loosen this bolt on the fixed idler, because there's play in that. When you loosen the bolt, the idler can move a little bit. It'll let me pop the belt over on this pulley, and then I can tighten this up and get this pulley back and check it all again. So let's give that a try. Well, that seemed to work, but I had to take the belt off, start with it on the crank, come around that movable idler pulley, stretch it tight, go around this cam, come under the water pump, go around this cam, come there. You can see how that idler pulley is offset there because the bolt is loose. I'm going to tighten that bolt up and it should bring that pulley back centered, and then we'll check the timing belt marks after that. All right, bolt is tight down there. The marks are still all lined up. Neither cam moved during this whole operation, and the crankshaft did not move. So I think we're going to go ahead and pull this pin for the tensioner. Last time I did, I remember I had to use pliers on it because it's in there pretty good. So we'll pull that, get tension on the belt, rotate the engine around a couple times and make sure it's okay, and we'll put her back together. All right, we rotated the engine around twice. Timing marks are still there on that cam. On that cam, and went down there and looked at it. It is straight up and perfect. So let's get her back together. The next thing to go on is this motor mount plate. Bolts on over the water pump there. So 3 14mm bolts, we'll get that installed. We used a socket or open end to get to one of the bolts, but there's a convenient hole in the inner fender if you want to do it that way too. So either way, pretty handy. Gave us an access hole to tighten that one motor mount bolt. Pretty good. Next thing on is the lower timing belt cover. There's 3 of them. There's 2 uppers and 1 lower. The lower goes on with 7 10mm shouldered bolts. Huh, it's even got a Honda part number on it. Look at that. All right, let's get it on there. The lower cover is on. Now it's time to put the 2 upper covers on. Top covers are on. There's a wire that gets clipped into this cover, and then another wire that gets clipped into this cover. So make sure you don't forget that. Don't forget this little screw here. Don't forget the belt guide. See, it's got an in and an out. I marked it before I took it off, but if you didn't mark yours, that's how it goes on. Like this dished area faces out. Anyway, that goes on over the keyway. Put the balancer back on. It's probably a 2-hand operation, so I'll be back. Balancer's on. We just got to put the bolt in and torque it down. Might as well put a new serpentine belt on. On this car, the serpentine belt drives the alternator and the air conditioner, and that's it. Power steering on this car is electric. Hold the tensioner back, you can pry it and put a little pin in it down there. I didn't have a pin at hand, so I just put the bolt in there and held it with the pry bar. The computer mount goes on with 3 10mm nuts. Let's get that attached. Let's put the computer back in. It just snaps into that plastic holder and the 2 wire connectors snap on it. So let's get that installed. Once you get the connector on, just flip this over, draws it in, they snap tight, and that's it. That goes to the air cleaner box. So let's get that on next. I put the computer in, but really I needed to get this motor mount in, but I can get to this bolt down there even if I have to use a swivel. But it's all good. I'm not taking those connectors back off that computer. So let's get the motor mount on, snap the computer back in place, and then we'll do the air box. The last time I did this job, this motor mount was all torn up and I had to get a new one, but this one looks okay. I don't see any tearing in it. Good thing it's about at least 80 bucks for a new one. It's best to start all these motor mount bolts and tighten them all up after you get everything started. These are 15s, these 2 are 18s, and then this one is an 18, I believe. So let's get those tightened up. All right, motor mount is installed. Computer's clipped back into its little plastic holder there. All we have to do is put on the air box and the air intake tube, and this job is done. Well, except for putting the coolant in and changing the thermostat, so we'll be doing that also as part of this job. Air box fits back in over that tube down there and then gets attached with 1 10mm bolt through all that. So let's wrestle this thing into place. Well, that was easy. So drop the air filter on there, only goes on one way. This fits on, swings in at that end, a couple clips at this end. We'll get that on and we'll be back. This tube has to go between here and here. Say you can angle it and push it in there. So let me wrestle with that off camera, and just attaches with 1 10mm bolt, and of course 2 hose clamps, 1 at each end, and we're good. That's the ticket right there. Goes right in. Look at that. All right. Okay, let's see if it runs. We'll just run it for a moment because it's low on coolant. But here goes nothing. Hey, look at that. Sounds good. All right. We'll get the thermostat changed and put some new coolant in it, and then we'll call this job done. Just for demonstration, here's another way to put the serpentine belt on. You could put a 14mm wrench with a pipe on it, tie it off to there, keep it over. You can also flex that thing over and put a drill bit or a pin in there, but it's so hard to get to it. I couldn't even get my hands in there to do that. That just shows you an alternate way of putting on the serpentine belt. Now we just have to put the splash shield back on. Take the little tips out of the bases, push the bases in, and then and just push the pin in, and that's it. Repeat for all the cylinders, and that's it for the splash shield. And that's it, the splash shield is installed. There's a little bit of rust on both sides here where this front subframe hooks on. This is a known trouble spot on these. I've got some 2x3 steel tubing, square tubing, that we're going to cut this out and then replace this area, put a new bolt through there. And this design that we're making should be a lot better. It won't be closed in like this one. This was closed in and a lot of dirt got in there. So we're going to have an improved design. The back subframe bolts are fine. The rest of the underside of the car is great. There's the drain petcock for the radiator. It's on the passenger side down low. It's up in that hole. It's a straight slot plug. Use a straight slot screwdriver to take it out. Don't want to risk stripping out the drain, so we'll just pop off this lower radiator hose with one of these tools that squeezes that thing. You can use channel locks, but I've got the right tool. So we'll pop that off and flush out the cooling system. Here's the final results of the timing belt replacement. It's a couple days later and it snowed, so we're getting some snow scenes and the final outro for this project. As always, thanks for watching. We'll see everybody on the next one. Take care.